join the congratulations for Arlen and Beth for organizing the conference. And not just because they're such good organizers, which they are, but I think the conference theme is brilliantly selected because there probably is a slow-burning crisis of reproduction in the United States and elsewhere in the neoliberal world. And that slow-burning crisis has not really been adequately explored, but it has two roots. One root is in the massive movement of women who did household work, reproductive work, into the labor force, with the consequence that all the caring work they did in the production and raising children and in care for sick family members and aging family members. Aging care is a very important problem. It's not that it's not being done, but how it's being done is a big problem, and partly through the super exploitation of women who are also working, and partly through patching together inadequate schemes of caretaking. The second root of the crisis, I think, is probably in austerity politics. You know, everybody, the media are full of stories about the Flint water crisis. The Flint water crisis has its roots in austerity politics, in an effort to cut costs in Flint by changing the source of the water that was supplied. But I think we don't know yet how many other places have contaminated water, have badly monitored, regulated public services, and all, because when you cut costs, that's what happens. You don't cut waste. They say they cut waste. You cut where you can cut politically. And that is not the same as making services more efficient. So I think that there's a huge set of issues here that is waiting to be discovered, and maybe Arlen and Beth are the pioneers of that discovery. So you ought to take your conference on the road, or I don't know exactly how you can build on it, but you definitely should build on it. I am going to talk about something that's related to the theme of the conference. By the way, the banner. I've never seen a banner like that at a conference. What is the work of blood today? Incredible, isn't it? Anyway, I'm going to talk about American poverty policies. Because I think that we're at a point in our kind of political history where we're almost ready to recognize, or at least people on the left are ready to recognize, that there is a crippling flaw in the way we think about and design our policies to deal with poverty. And what is that crippling flaw that makes it? It's a crippling flaw, at least if your criterion for success is the reduction of poverty. Now, not everybody's criterion of success is the reduction of poverty, should we say. Well, we have 45.3 million people who are officially poor in the United States today. You know, we're the richest country in the world by a handsome margin. And our poverty level is actually quite meager. It's an old-fashioned market basket measure of poverty. And 45 million people are officially poor. That's about between, depending on your measure, 15 and 18% of the population. More than that, we have a measure called extreme poverty, which is half this very inadequate and old-fashioned poverty level. And we have 3 million kids in extreme poverty. Now, I want to say that whenever people talk about reproductive problems, they talk about kids. It's not just kids, it's all of us. It really is all of us that are together engaged in the reproduction of our culture, our economy, our communities. So, why are our policies so lousy? Well, of course they're so lousy because the rich are greedy, and generous poverty policies have an impact on the labor market and on taxes. But I also think the way we think about poverty policies cripples us, and that, I think, the way the right thinks about poverty policies and also the way the left thinks about poverty policies. I think for a very long time, actually centuries, although it was articulated in the 19th century by the English Poor Law Commissioners. For a very long time, the principle of less eligibility has been of overwhelming importance in the way we think about and design poverty policies. Now, a lot of you will know and remember that the principle of less eligibility, as it was expressed by the Poor Law Commissioners of 1834, meant that no one who lives on parish relief shall be as well off as the meanest of laborers. In other words, if we're going to allow people who are poor to survive, give them a subsistence income, we have to ensure that the way of life that results is not as good, is not as dignified as that of the very lowest worker. That's the principle of less eligibility. Now, I'd like to point out to you that it's very similar to the way people understand what you might call the principle of eliminating dependency. Because in the last couple of decades, when we've had these big arguments about welfare policy, for example, we've said that the problem with welfare or with food stamps or with any other kind of assistance to the poor, the problem is that it causes dependency. Now, what does that mean? Aside from the fact that we are all frail human animals and therefore dependent in one way or another, that would make it an idiotic statement. It's not what they mean. What they mean is that the availability of welfare or food stamps makes it possible for people not to take the lowest wage work. That's dependency. It's the same as the principle of less eligibility. So, that principle, less eligibility, dependency, call it what you want, guides our programs to assist the poor. If that imposes a kind of discipline on those programs, that means that we will never give the poor enough to live and hold up their heads. It ensures the misery of the poor. It ensures their degradation because there's a less eligibility not only of economic circumstance, there's a less eligibility of social dignity. So that's my argument. Now, I think that everybody across the political spectrum in the United States has bought the idea of less eligibility. The right buys it, of course. because it justifies a welfare system that enforces the lowest wage labor because people won't have any choice. But the left buys it too. I don't. Liberals buy it. Left-wingers buy it. Bernie Sanders, in a way, buys it. Because what's Bernie Sanders said about poverty? Full employment. That's the only thing. Raise the minimum wage. That's the only thing that he has said, to the best of my knowledge, about poverty. He argues for, essentially, full employment, which means tight labor markets. Everybody can get a job, no matter how crippled, how old, how worn out. Well, that will lead to decent paying jobs, because if labor markets are tight, employers will have to raise wages in order to get workers, right? That almost never happens. Why doesn't it happen? Because employers are very politically powerful in the United States. And even now, when the unemployment level is 5%, that's not a tight labor market. They are worried, and worrying the Federal Reserve about the dangers of inflation, by which they mean, and it's all they mean, that wages will go up. That's all they mean by inflation. It's all they consider. So, so we've been caught in this set of propositions that we can't be generous to the poor unless labor markets are so tight, but they'll never get that tight, that the amount of assistance you give to the poor has no bearing on the willingness to work. Given that sort of matrix of poverty thinking, we have had policies that have allowed for some exceptions. There have been some exceptions. And those exceptions have had to do with reproduction. Not the care of the old. We don't ever take care of that. But rather the care of newborns and young children. So we have had, been terrible programs, but we have had programs called widows' pensions, beginning about the turn of the 20th century, which gave some assistance to widows, provided that they were certified as extremely moral individuals who never saw men or anything of that sort, and were subject to investigation and to scrutiny by family service workers and so forth. And at the depths of the Great Depression, after an interlude of emergency relief that was really good, it was a good program. Everybody who needed assistance got assistance from the same program. None of this fussing about what category you go into, what are the, how do we monitor your use of the assistance? But that only lasted 2 years. If that, it was actually more like a year and a half. And then widows' pensions was replaced with a program first called ADC, Aid to Dependent Children, and then called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which did provide assistance to women raising small children, but there were massive exclusions. Massive exclusions. It didn't provide much assistance for fear that some of the money would go to people who were considered workers. And it didn't provide assistance to black women raising small children in the South at times where there was work to be done in the fields, for example. fuzzy programs, but there was something there. And the justification for giving something, even under arduous conditions, was that these were mothers. These people who were getting assistance were mothers. Well, in the 1960s, I think everybody in this room knows about the welfare rights movement as one of a kind of series of rolling movements that arose in the big cities. There were protests and organized protests, persistent protests by Black women and Hispanic women who were on welfare against the restrictive character of AFPC. Now, it's easy to see the fuel for those protests, because to some extent they had similar roots as the protests about schools and by Blacks, and the protests about housing, and the protests about jobs. To some extent. But they were also distinctive, because these were protests by women raising children on their own, women who were sort of doubly or triply degraded. They were Black, they were poor, they were Hispanic, they were poor. And you know what else? They were often divorced, or they had never gotten married. They were raising kids on their own. I was on the board of one of the groups that formed the Central Harlem Welfare Rights Group. And these women who were also on the board with me, when we had meetings, they always called me by the honorific Mrs. Piven. They never called me that outside of these meetings, but I was to call them that too. It was an honorific. Now, this is in about 1966, 67, 68, and there were countless meetings in people's living rooms or in church basements of women beginning to organize, beginning to protest, beginning to assert that they had a right to welfare, or they had a right to a special grant for school children, school clothing for their children. And at every one of those meetings, the question arose, and it had to be answered. Why are we entitled to money from the welfare system? For school clothing or for rent? Why are we entitled to that? They had to know. And they answered the question, and they always answered it the same way. They were entitled to help from the government because they were raising children. Now, there is an incredible irony in this development, because the welfare rights movement was of some importance in liberalizing one of our important poverty policies. But this movement and its core justification arose at the same time as a new feminist movement was emerging, which was asserting its freedom from the bonds of domesticity and from family-based domestic roles. You know, the truth is that in its early days, it changed later, much later, but in its early days, now and welfare rights were like, really? Because now was making arguments that was so different from the aspiration of welfare moms for some respect in the roles that they were playing. Well, so NWRO, the National Welfare Rights Organization, helped women to discover the identity and the dignity inherent in that, in the identity of their family role, their role as mother. And NWRO also helped bring into existence the litigation which secured a series of court decisions which actually guaranteed welfare benefits to these mothers. And NWRO also changed the sort of day-to-day policy of welfare because women would be in the centers and they'd be raising hell. And raising hell in the cities of the United States in the late 1960s, very dangerous. The demonstrations of the Boston Welfare Rights Group helped to trigger the Boston riots, which lasted for several days and nights, because the women yelled out to the street for help. So welfare expanded, the policies became more liberal, and that was a kind of achievement. You all know what happened to that achievement. Well, in a certain sense, all of this was too late. The feminist movement reflected the fact that a massive change was occurring. Women were moving into the labor force in huge numbers. We don't talk about that. That's why we have maybe a simmering crisis of reproduction. It's because of the huge transformation that has occurred in the American labor market. Women are half of the labor market. You get all these reports from the federal government about women's unemployment, male unemployment. You know, they're about neck and neck. And that massive movement of women into the labor market made the demands of welfare rights very, very difficult and very, very precarious. You know what actually happened is that in the 1970s, the liberalization of welfare, which the movement had a lot to do with, the larger black movement as well, the liberalization of welfare meant that welfare benefit levels and welfare coverage was out of kilter with the principle of less eligibility. Welfare benefits had risen, coverage had expanded, and something had to be done, or they thought something had to be done. And that set in motion an effort to reform welfare. Because of course the reform of welfare just made it much, much worse. The reform of welfare, which was attempted throughout the 70s and 80s, and finally was realized in the 1990s, meant that the principle of less eligibility was restored to the American welfare system. Under the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which was passed in 1996, you know, the Clintons sort of evade their responsibility for this legislation. But in the preceding presidential election, Bill Clinton had campaigned on the slogan, 2 years and off to work, end welfare as we know it. And then when the Republicans took over the Congress under Newt Gingrich's leadership in 1994, a real blow to the Democrats and to democratic social policy. That's capital D, not small d. When the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, Gingrich and the Republican leadership pushed through welfare reform, series of welfare reform bills, 3 actually, and Clinton finally signed one, with Hillary's support, by the way. Let's tell the truth. The result of that new system was that where before the bill, 68% of poor families with children had gotten some assistance from the welfare system. After the bill, the percentage of families with children, poor families with children who were assisted, dropped to 26%. That's a huge change. Even during the Great Recession, which is, I suppose, over, even when unemployment was as high as 10%, the states continued to cut the welfare rolls. 16 states saw declining welfare rolls when state unemployment was over 10%. So, how did the welfare rolls decline under this new welfare policy and its system of implementation? Well, there were work requirements in the law, that's true. And there was a 5-year limit on receiving assistance, basically a 2-year limit without work. But there was a feature of this legislation which was in a way more insidious and less easy for people to recognize. And that is that the states were given huge incentives to figure out how to get those people off the rolls. And the huge incentive was this. The welfare dollars were changed into a block grant. The state got its share of the block grant, no matter how many people were given assistance. In other words, if they didn't spend the money on benefits to poor people, they could spend it on other programs that were arguably somehow related to poverty. Tremendous incentive. And they used it. So, well, you know, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act and its implementation was a national calamity that we did not see. Nobody reported it. Nobody dramatized it. Everybody's talking about the Flint water. Yeah, that's a sin. That's terrible. That's awful. What about those millions of families and more millions of children whose income source had been cut off and whose mothers had to go to work without regular, standard child care, with some sort of patched together arrangement? Maybe the drug-addicted brother-in-law was taking care of the kids. We did that to millions of children. And nobody said there's a crisis of reproduction. But of course there was, and there is a crisis of reproduction, because we still don't have child care, decent child care, licensed child care for the children of those millions of women who have now entered the labor force. So, there was, by the way, a child care bill that passed the Congress by large margins in 1972 for a national child care system it was vetoed by Richard Nixon, but that's just a little footnote on history. So I think that we need to think through and to begin to organize new approaches for a rational poverty policy, a rational policy of income supports. And a rational policy will sever the connection between poverty and wage work. Let's just sever them. We don't need workers. We're putting millions of people in jail, young men, because we don't need them in the workforce. That's why they're going to jail, truth is. We don't need workers. We also know that if women and men, if both the heads of households have wage work obligations, maybe 40 hours a week, maybe 60 hours a week, and maybe they don't know what the hours are because they have the kind of job where you're not told in advance. If that kind of wage work is very destructive of the ability of people to fulfill their caring obligations to children, to sick family members, to the old. So it's bad for that reason. We also know we don't want so much wage work. We don't want the economic growth that is associated with wage work. You know those New Deal politicians, and this includes Bernie, who I'm going to vote for. Those New Deal politicians, they're forever talking about full employment and economic growth. Economic growth means more of those fossil fuels out of the ground and into the air. No more economic growth. We have enough pollution, and we also have enough of the junk that we produce, that produces in turn pollution. And finally, we all also ought to begin to say, what's so great about wage work? Can you think of other ways to spend your time?